Welcome back, Visions fans. Ready Player Will here. I'm going over another classroom session here, really defining what effective HP is. I talk about it on my DPS report cards. I've talked about it at high level a couple times, but I wanted to get into just a little bit of the math, what it means when you dig down a little deeper, and then how there may be some gaps in the way I analyze and how you might think of it. So sit tight. This won't be too complex, but just a little bit of thought behind this, so get your thinking caps on. Defining effective HP, what is it? And I've said this before. It's your health pool, but it's been adjusted for things like defense, spirit, your resists, so that it's not necessarily a measure of the hit points, but really a concept of how much damage do you have to do to someone in order to kill them. And that'll hopefully make a little more sense here in a second, where if you were to look at someone like Whisper, and this is I think my favorite example because she's known for her resists, she's got 3078 HP with a passive, and Jaden's HP is 3089. If you were to just look at their health points, you would conclude that they're of similar bulkiness. Well, they're not. They have different kinds of defense and spirit, different kinds of resists. And so just the hit points by themselves don't really tell you anything. They're nominal numbers, as we call them in economics. We need to kind of convert them into real numbers, where you essentially adjust them for things that make them kind of more comparative. So if we're getting to the actual example of how you would do that, Whisper only has 3078 with the passive. She technically has 30% slash resistance and 6 defense. So if you're trying to consider what's her real effective HP when you're doing a slash attack against her, and essentially figure out how much slash damage you have to send her way before you start accounting for resistance, defense, and element resistance, things of that nature, take their HP, divide it by, and this is where order of operations becomes important. You have to do the bottom first, the denominator first. It's 1 minus the defense times 1 minus the slash resistance. So in this case, you would do 1 minus 0.06 because you have to convert the defense to a decimal, and 1 minus 0.3. So I have this down here. So essentially, if we were to plug it in, her effective HP against slash attacks is really 4,677. And this is why it matters if we now, again, compare her to Jaden, who has no defense and no slash resistance, 0% on both. Jaden's effective HP against slash attacks is still his, 3,089, whereas Whisper comparatively is 4,677. You can conclude that she's tankier against slash type attacks than Jaden is, and you'd be correct. That's accurate. So that's essentially how you want to think of it, and you can apply that to all the other attack types. If you wanted to do missile resist, you do 1 minus missile resist instead. If it was magic oriented attacks, you have to change the defense to spirit instead. So there's some small tweaks there. So it is fairly complex if you were to build it out larger, which I do in my own spreadsheet. I was kind of walk through here very high level what it exactly is I do. So I have a list of all the characters. I have their HP of equipping passives and whatnot, defense and spirit with those passives, and then their slash and respective resistances as well. I then have a calculation here that kind of does the calculation we did on the prior page, which gives me their effective HPs of each kind. And then really just kind of a final one where I look at, effective physical HP only, looking at the physical types. And then I have a weighted calculation, and then I actually have a meta calculation, just really high level going through what they are. Effective physical HP, so this ephys column that's right here, it's a weighted average of the 4 of these, so slash, pierce, strike, missile. So I weight them all together equally, and that's their effective physical HP. The effective magical HP that I grade them on is just this single column by itself. It's their effective magic HP. So this is their health points adjusted for their spirit and adjusted for their magic resistance. The weighted HP, I actually put a small tweak on this. So I essentially have to combine all of the types together, right? Well, slash and magic are by far the 2 most prevalent attack types in the game. Pierce, strike, and missile are a little more niche. They're a little more unique to certain characters. So I have to weight it just slightly differently, and hopefully this makes some sense, where I weight the effective slash HP 33%, the magic HP 33%, and then I take an average of the other 3 and weight that 33%. When you combine them all, that's kind of like a general effective HP that takes into account the damage types you see most often. And then finally, the weighted meta EHP is essentially my calculation for Elena and Jaden as light units, where I kind of switch things around, where I completely ignore pierce and strike damage, because neither of those characters do pierce or strike, neither does Engelbert. So I effectively weighted 33% slash, 33% missile, and 33% magic. The big caveat here is I actually changed the way the slash HP is calculated, and I used the character's spirit instead of defense, because when Elena and Jaden attack, they scale off your spirit stat rather than your defense stat. So this effective missile HP, if you were to look at it right now on the screen, is scaling off the character's defense, which is not a good indicator of how they would stand up to Jaden. Obviously, you could think of a myriad of different ways you could twist and contort this to get to some answers, but I feel like this is a good general way to look at it. Now, where are there gaps in an analysis like how I'm doing it here? And there actually are a couple. Number one, I'm assuming a reasonably average build. I can only pick 2 passives. So we're looking at someone like Renan here, where on the previous page I had HP with passives and their spirit with passives. Well, I gotta pick them, and I have to pick which ones I think are reasonable that you'll see most often. So, for instance, for my Renan analysis, I have Lightning Conductor as 1, so I add 12 spirit, and then I actually have Devout Intuition as the second passive, so I give him an extra 15 defense on my calculations. Now, if you were using Magic level 1 instead, well, his effective HP is going to be lower than what my calculation says, because I'm assuming a different passive, and I can only do so many passives, so I just kind of pick what I think is reasonable. But theoretically, there's some characters where their passives tweak what that is in total. The second thing is there's no way to quantify barriers, which is important. I kind of build that into the letter grade instead. So, for instance, Varouche to me is an A plus magic effective HP, where he has a great magic effective HP by itself, but the fact that he has a magic barrier elevates him even more. You could probably build it in a little bit where you calculate the damage reduction that a barrier would do, but to me, I don't like doing that because you have to assume that the character actually uses the barrier as part of your turn order. You have to assume that also there's no barrier break on the enemy team, which would make it useless and overinflate their effective HP. So that's kind of where I put it in the letter grade instead. It's also hard to segregate AoE and unit resistance because that whole spreadsheet I'd effectively have to make 2 of them, one for AoE attacks and one versus unit attacks. So King Mont, for instance, has 10 AoE resistance innately. That's not really factored into my calculations, but it's something that I kind of put into the letter grade when I think about their overall bulkiness. Just to simplify doing double the amount of work. And then finally, it's hard to quantify evasion and the courage impact that when you talk about survivability overall. And we'll get into a little more of this in a second here, where looking at units comparatively does help. If I'm looking at evasion, for instance, this is just a selection of a lot of the top tier evade units and what their weighted EHP is. And I'm going to pick on Prompto here for a second, where when I was initially doing this, I'm looking at the weighted EHP and I'm like, okay, he's on average 600 to 1,000 less than his counterpart evade units. And then if I'm looking at his actual evasion rate, he's actually 10 to 20% less evasive than those same units, not including the fact that most of them, the top 5 or 6 here, have courage or re-raise or barrier like 2B. So when I was doing the effective calculation for Prompto, I actually went easy on him in hindsight. This is kind of when I first was rolling out the report card. He should actually be a D, I think, in effective HP, where, if I'm looking at evasion units comparatively, he is way below them in terms of the actual HP stats, and he's way below them for evasion rate, and he doesn't have the same survivability with courage and re-raise and barriers, so effectively, he's much more of a glass cannon. I think I emphasized that in the presentation, but the letter grade I don't think represents that. When you're talking about tanks and DPS and bruisers and supports, I do tend to segregate them as well to kind of compare them to each other as a sort of barometer for where I think the grade ends up being. So it's not a perfect science. There is obviously math involved to it, but there's also a lot of judgment calls and some assumptions made to kind of make the whole thing work. So that's effective HP in a nutshell. Hopefully that was insightful to what I do to make that analysis work. Hopefully learned a little bit from that, and happy to answer any questions you might have. I think this is a really interesting way to look at characters. Obviously does not really correlate to the strength of them, where their kit is probably more impactful, and what the balance of the game is in terms of vision cards and espers. HP is really just only one way to think of a character. So thanks for watching, and I'll talk to you all soon.